Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's TheJournal.ie Facebook debate on the Public Services Card. Now, one of these. It's something that's been causing a lot of controversy in the last weeks and months. This evening we're going to try and settle the question, is it something you should care about or is it just a storm in a teacup? Now, with us to discuss this we have digital rights campaigner and solicitor Simon McGarr and Irish Times columnist and barrister Noel Wheland. Thanks very much for being here, guys. Thank you. Now, before we start, we're going to be keeping an eye on your comments and your opinions on this. So please do, if you have anything to say at all, just stick it in the comment box directly below the video. And without further ado, let's get started. So, Noel, I'm going to come to you first. About 2 weeks ago, Minister for Social Protection, Regina Doherty, said that the Public Services Card is mandatory but not compulsory when it comes to claiming welfare benefits. That seems like something of a contradiction in terms. What's your take on it? It
does, of course, seem like a contradiction in terms. I think the distinction she was trying to make and didn't make well was that the concept of an identity card, which is generally perceived as that it's something you must both compulsory have, you have to have it, but secondly, you have to have it on or about your person. It comes from the, I think in the public mind, as people define it in their own minds, it comes from the suggestion that a police officer or an official can at any time stop you and ask you to prove your identity. To that extent, it is not a compulsory or an identity card. Of course, what is now clear is that the government approach and decision isn't it's a legitimate policy decision for them to make, is that in order to engage with public services, you need to provide the public service card or an identity that's verified by the public service card in order to access those services, whether it's for payments, and large payment, whether it's for social welfare payments now, or whether it's for a range of other additional public services.
Well, okay. So Noel's suggesting that it's a legitimate policy decision. Simon, would you agree with that at all?
Yes, it's a legitimate policy decision, absolutely. The difficulty is that policy decisions aren't the same as laws. And if you want to change the legal position of people's rights in terms of getting access to their passport, in terms of getting access to a driving licence, in terms of getting access to their social welfare benefits, whether those are pensions or children's benefit or whatever they are, then you have to write that in the law. And the difficulty is that, as I think has become clear over the last couple of weeks, the state has been proceeding in implementing its decision and its policy wishes without having a legislative basis to stand over.
So you don't believe that the legals are correctly in place for this?
No, I mean, the Department of Social Welfare was asked, what's your legal basis for requiring a lady whose pension was cut off, requiring her to get a public services card, and at the price of her pension? If she didn't get one, she couldn't have it. And they cited Section 247C of the 2005 Social Welfare Amendment Act, Social Welfare Act. And if you go and read Section 247, it describes how you can prove your identity. Now, the lady said, here I am, I have met all the requirements of that statutory provision, I have proved my identity, I have done all those things, I've even proved them using the methods that you've said I should do. Please now show me why it is that you're requiring me to have my data placed inside the single customer view database. Show me why I have to have a public services card issued. It doesn't say that anywhere in this piece of legislation. And their response was, we're stopping your pension.
Well, Noel, you were writing about that a week ago and you said that that's fair enough. This is something that has to be done in order to deliver such benefits uniformly across the board.
Well, nobody would be comfortable with a situation where somebody felt they couldn't access social welfare payments they were entitled to. And that's why, and this lady says she's been through the appeals process in the department, one would hope for a more positive engagement by the department and the individual as to resolve that outstanding issue. But let's come back to a couple of central points here. One of the most curious things around the debate, which got over dramatic in the last couple of weeks of August, was the suggestion as to whether or not there's a legal basis for the public sector card. Now, the question is, it's really strange to hear lawyers, and in fairness to Simon, he doesn't use these words here today, but to hear lawyers use phrases like, it doesn't appear to have a legal basis, or it doesn't have a robust legal basis. Simon, in fairness to him, claims that it doesn't have a legal basis. And if he says it doesn't have a legal basis, then his situation is actually, his view on the law is even different than that of the Data Protection Commissioner. Because she doesn't say that it does not have a legal basis.
But in fairness, the Data Protection Commissioner has asked the Minister for Social Protection to show some transparency at this.
Yeah, exactly. The Data Protection Commissioner has says, please publish a questions and answers document and here are the questions we'd like you to answer. But the Data Protection Commissioner has not said it doesn't have a legal basis. In fact, her criticism is that the Minister is relying on generic provisions across various pieces of legislation rather than a specific provision that would deal specifically with a public sector
I'm going to
card.
bring Simon in this because he looked like he had something to say.
Well, yes, I mean, what happens is that the Data Protection Commissioner has said that she has been asking questions about this for quite some time. And
But
in
she
the
hasn't
middle,
said it doesn't have a legal basis.
she doesn't, and that's because in order to do so, she'd have had to make a decision.
Exactly.
And if she had to make a decision now, she wouldn't have given the proper due process to the government to provide it with the answers.
But one would presume that's a decision. I mean, if the Data Protection Commissioner is, and regulators are increasingly important in our system, is the regulator for data protection. Before one would set out requiring a card of 1,000 people, one would assume the Data Protection Commissioner would form her own definitive view as to whether something did or did not have a legal basis. By the time to get
the Commissioner
2.8 million
can't
being
do
used,
that. The Commissioner
So
isn't
she
allowed.
can't offer a view.
She can offer a view, but she can't make a decision. And what she's and the reason for that is the Commissioner can't pre-approve projects by the government.
But this is not pre-approved. 2.8 million people have been asked,
Regrettably, it
required,
isn't pre-approved.
you would suggest, to provide this card. If the card is illegal, if there isn't a legal basis for it, then the Data Protection Commissioner should say that. If the card is illegal and there isn't a legal basis for it, then some innovative solicitor or civil rights data protection group should, like all civil rights campaigners have previously, take an action that would test it. We are 2.8 million cards into this process. It has a legal basis. One would prefer, like a lot of areas of law, that it was in a self-contained act all in one place that was more transparent. But that's not the same thing as to say it doesn't have a legal basis. That's one of the confusions.
We'll come back to the 2.8 million cards in a moment. I just want to bring in a few comments that are coming from our live stream. Hilda Grace says there's nothing wrong with an identity card. Nearly every other country has one. I don't understand why anyone has a problem with it. Now, the government has been denying that it's an identity card, so maybe we'll come back to that. John Devlin says, I've no problem with it. People say it's an invasion of privacy, but yet they put everything up about themselves on Facebook. If you pay your bills and taxes and contribute to society, what do you have to worry about? Now, just to remind you all that if you stick any good comments underneath the video, we will try and read them out. Now, Noel, to come back to the 2.8 million cards, it's 5 years we're on the road now with this. Yes. Why is it becoming such an issue now?
That's the curiosity. I mean, frankly, as I wrote myself, I think because it became a dramatic issue for the last 10 days of August, because August by its very nature is downtime in the political realm, I expected, and I think we've been proven right in the last week, that it was always going to fall off the agenda when more substantial issues of public policy and politics emerged at the beginning of September, as they have this week. I mean, the department wrote out, and of course one can take issue that people were required to take up a card in order to get the payment, but we are required to do an awful lot of things to get a passport. Anybody who is paid by the state for a service is required to take a whole range of steps in order to. On foot of law. You know, on foot of law, on foot of specific law in some areas, and on foot of delegated and other powers to a department to impose requirements as to how a particular legal requirement would be met.
Which no one has cited here.
Well, for example, in the section they cite, and you dealt with, Simon, it says that you must provide identity as required. And if the department specifies this is the way it wants to require identity,
it does specify how that requirement is to be dealt with
in
that provision, and it doesn't involve a card.
If you don't meet the requirements of any funding scheme or any payment scheme, I mean, I don't know if you do civil legal aid, but in order to get paid for civil legal aid work as a barrister, you have to register annually on that panel. You have to certify that you are a member of the Bar Council. You have to sign on each case. A registrar in the court has to confirm your identity and that you were there. And even if you do the work, if you haven't done those things, you don't get paid the payment.
But Noel, if it hasn't been debated and if specific legislation hasn't been passed, then why can't people choose how they want to claim benefits? Why does the government...
But the issue has been debated. The issue of a public sector card has been debated. The contention from Simon and others is that this is an identity card by stealth, and they say that hasn't been debated.
I want to ask
that's the distinction.
I want to ask what I think is a key question here, Simon. I'll go to you first. Why should people care about this? Noel has described it as silly season, as in there's no other real news to write about. It's something that will disappear. Why do you think that people should care about the public services card?
Well, first of all, in terms of a topic, the public services card is a pretty radical redefinition of the relationship between the citizen and the state. There isn't a tradition in common law jurisdictions of having a peacetime identity card. In fact, the only countries that have them at the moment are Burma, Hong Kong, Cyprus, and Singapore. In terms of the common law tradition.
Do not most EU countries have like a national ID
Yes,
card?
and interestingly, the EU comes from a different, the continental EU comes from a different legal tradition. One where, for example, if you're in Germany, you register with your local town hall to tell them that you're in the location. This isn't a tradition that we've subscribed to. We go for a much more liberal tradition in terms of the relationship between citizens and the state, and the notion of an identity card where people can ask you to, could I see your identity card, please? Can you show me your papers? The very thing that Noel was saying, no one has made that mandatory yet, was very much debated when this card was originally mooted back in 2005. Its predecessor, which was the old white card with the number on it. And one of the primary protections against that coming into being, where you would be asked, can I see your card, please, was to ensure that when people if people were asked to see the card, that would be an offence to ask to see the card.
But do you accept, Simon, that we're not there yet? We're not, you used the phrase yet. You said we are not at that point yet. Your concern is that we may be getting there, but we are not there. It's a separate policy decision to say that people must carry something around with them that any guard or official at a certain place and time can require them to produce in order for them to be let past, to prove their identity or whatever.
Example.
We are not there yet because that's an entirely separate policy decision.
Sure.
And the political stance from the government and others is that they are not going there.
One of the steps you'd have to have if you wanted to get there would be to make it not an offence to ask to see your ID card. And that's one of the things that the government is currently doing in a bill which is before the Oireachtas right now. Section 5 of the Social Welfare Pensions and Civil Partnership Bill actually deals with removing the problems of asking for your card. And now the result will be that the card will now be, people can ask to see your identity card, something that wasn't the case until that bill becomes law. Now these are steps.
That sounds quite like Big Brother, doesn't it?
These are incremental steps because it doesn't require you to give the card. The result is that you simply have, say, a situation where landlords can ask to see it, and you can choose not to show it. And they can choose to make decisions of what they want to do about that when you turn up and don't give them the card. That the police can ask to see it, but you can choose not to give it, and the police can decide what they're going to do about that. Now, what we have here is we don't have a compulsory card, but we've certainly removed the primary protection that the state recognised it could give to prevent a compulsory card being coming into force, and certainly to prevent pressure being put on people to produce its card, making it de facto compulsory.
No, would you have an issue with a compulsory card, an entirely compulsory card?
Of course I would. Of course I would. But let's be careful. Let's start with some premises. Sharing information in within systems of certain terms of control is a very positive thing. It is now the engine through which all of the, in a sense, advances that have been made in terms of social media, in terms of online purchasing, shopping, in terms of online activism, etc. It all requires that we volunteer to share information. We provide information. Various companies require us of us. They say, you want to come onto our platform, you have to provide certain information. You have the choice, of course, of not coming onto our platform. And we share now, what more strikingly in those cases is they then independently have, because they can access our behaviour and monitor our behaviour and data mine our behaviour, have access to an awful lot more information than anything like the public service card would ever have. What I'm saying to you is, of itself, sharing information is not something that we need to be afraid of. It is designed to improve the efficiency of our lives and our services, and that's ultimately what it does in the realm of the public service card. If I have a card and I don't have to separately establish a whole range of separate proofs to get a passport if I'm a new passport holder, if I have a card and I don't separately have to establish, if I'm a young person, a whole separate checks of proofs to do the online, what do they call it? I'm too old to remember to having done one. The driving test.
I failed spectacularly.
The theory test. You know, and then people say, well, it's a concern that it's been shared by more bodies, but it has to be shared by more bodies if the requirement that you repeat the information or meet the tests again for the next body is to be avoided. The whole purpose of the
okay, well, I'm going to interrupt you there and bring in a few more comments from people who are watching. Tom Sievers says the argument, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about, does not stick. The government targeted social welfare claimants first, as they'll find it toughest to say no, which is an interesting point. John Joseph Healy says that information in the wrong hands is always a dangerous move. And Stephen Lynch says, why do I need to get a card for a passport or driver's licence? I have a PPS number. That should be enough. We'll come on to that now in a second. Again, once more, I'm going to ask you that if you have anything to say, anything whatsoever, just stick it in the comments box below the video and we'll try and deal with it as best we can. Now, onto the passport issue, Simon.
Well, I just want to deal with the question of data sharing, because actually this is an interesting point, and it's the difference between the administrative approach, which is if you're the civil service, you want access to all the data so you can move it around and see what uses you can make of it, and what you would term the human rights approach, which is to say that actually this isn't data, these are people's lives, the signifiers of them in terms of, and I mean the Minister found herself in a terrible quicksand trying to argue biometric data wasn't biometric data, but in the end this comes down to things in relations to human dignity. That's why we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights recognises data protection law. And data protection law doesn't say people can't use data. That's not what it's for. What it says is that the use of data should be necessary and proportionate, and no more than is necessary and proportionate to do a legitimate function. Now, there are lots of ways legitimate functions can be defined, and one of them is to say it's for the purpose of, say, for example, performing a lawful activity. You passed a law, everyone debated it, we said that this was okay, you therefore don't rely on consent anymore, you've got a law that you can point to. There are other issues as to whether the law is legitimate and proportional, but that's secondary. But what happens is that the administrative impulse, which is to say, look at all this data we have, how helpful it would be if we shared it around and made it accessible by lots of people. That impulse is itself not valid if there isn't a legitimate basis for sharing the data, any more than is necessary and proportionate.
Can I ask Noel, what do you think of the government's performance as regards this little controversy? How has it been? Simon has mentioned Regina Doherty, she's been on the airwaves quite a few times in the last 2 weeks, sometimes not entirely sounding totally sure of what she's talking about. Do you think maybe they've made something of a mountain out of a molehill for themselves?
Well, three answers to that. One, firstly, the capacity of anybody's communication is often shaped by people's view whether they agree with them or not. Those who agree with the minister think she may have communicated brilliantly. Those who disagree think she has communicated disastrously. Some of us who watch this stuff every week say that's a power performance and no more. Secondly, inevitably, the government, like everybody else, estivates or hibernates across the summer, so they're often slower cranking up in those circumstances. Does the debate serve a purpose? Yes, in reminding people of the existence of the public sector card. This is not the first time it has been debated. As I say, like the suggestion is almost that it has snuck up on people. The government voted to 2.8 million people. If you Google it, you'll be sick with images of Pascal Donoghue waving the card around at various press launches. So it didn't just happen.
I think it was just one press launch.
It was public, but the photograph is there on all of the stories. It is literally. They made an effort of publicising it to their credit as part of a public service reform.
What would you say to that, Simon?
I would say that they went out and said you have to get this card. Now what happened was, I mean, the core of this is, and one of your commentators there astutely recognises there's a sort of a realism about it. The core of this is that the government signed a contract and they will have to pay for 3 million cards. Come hell or high water, they wish to issue 3 million cards by the end of this year. If they don't issue the 3 million cards, they still have to pay for them.
But isn't it reassuring that the government negotiates a contract that has performance indicators for itself? And I mean, what's the point of rolling out the system unless you have benchmarks by which you affect it? The Data Protection Commissioner's own word was, it's a legitimate policy objective for the government to introduce a public sector card of this type. We live in an increasingly diverse world, an increasingly urbanised world, in an increasingly mobile society. It is harder to determine who is who, and establishing somebody's identity and then establishing that they are only, in a sense, applying under schemes or systems as one person and not the same person applying with multiple identities, that requires an increasingly sophisticated level of identity testing. And the private sector is addressing that radically and rapidly. There's no reason why public sector services should be left behind.
Well, I mean, if we're going to look at this in terms of fraud, which is the primary statement. Although it should be said that wasn't the reason that the government started this project. The Department of Department of Public Enterprise and Reform is the driving force behind this, not the Department of Social Protection. The Department of Social Protection is the primary engine for issuing these cards, largely because it has the largest group of people who are either fully or partially dependent upon government services and government payments in order to make sure that there are cornflakes in the bowl in the morning. And therefore, they are the people who are at the sharp end on this.
It is also the largest service. The largest government service is the payment of welfare payments.
And it should be noted that
the biggest chunk of it being child benefit.
That Deeper had an internal ministerial briefing note which was released on FOI, and one of the things that was said to the minister was to explain that we signed a contract. Generally speaking, when we have fixed term contracts, the state generally tries to have the fixed term contract or the fixed price contract in their favour, not in the favour of the person that they're giving it. In other words, that they promise to buy a certain amount and then they have to race to try and meet that amount.
If you were rolling out a public service card, then of course you would begin with the biggest public service, the one that involves
and the people
most
with the
money.
least power. And I think one of the reasons why
but
it's coming up
the
now
volume
is that
is-
we've been seeing people who are frankly not beholden to the Department of Social Protection receiving letters such as people saying, wait a minute, I've got a car. I'm just a plump, over-upholstered lawyer, and yet here I am getting a request to use my photograph to issue me with a public service card.
An inverse snobbery or
Lads, I'm
discrimination.
going to interrupt you and bring in a few comments from people who are watching, and the first one I think is a very interesting one. Brian Canavan says that Google and Facebook know 100 times more than you than this card does, which is possibly not an invalid thing to say. Jenny Matthews-Line says, what about people who are housebound? How do they get a card, and why should they need it in the first place? John Hopkins says, I'm all for national IDs. Who cares? Nothing to hide, nothing to worry about. Now, I want to come back to Brian Canavan's point about Google and Facebook. Most of us, nearly everyone, I would think, has a smartphone at this stage. They're probably signed up to countless free apps, and they're giving away their data at the same time. So what is the difference between that and what's expected of us with the public services card, Simon?
What we have is a question of whether you wish to choose to do so, and it's absolutely your choice to share
Most people
your
mightn't
data.
realise they're choosing to do so.
Well, that's and the other question is, what will you do if you decide that you don't like having done it? You can actually write to any private sector entity and say, delete my data. What we have here is we have the force of state coercion, not available to Google, not available to Facebook. We have the force of state coercion. We'll actually cut off your income if you do not do this. Now, Facebook can, at the very worst, promise to close down your account, but they won't actually cut off your payments.
But in every single scheme where the government makes a payment or pays a professional like us or anybody for a service, there are various tests, administrative tests, you have to meet. If you don't meet them, you don't get paid.
In law.
Yeah, but
And what we have is
and
we
the-
have
and
an
the law
additional test
and the
beyond the
law
law.
leaves a large element of discretion, as you know, in delegated legislation and even beyond that, to whoever is designing the administrative scheme as to what is necessary, because it varies from scheme to scheme as to what would be required. Having one card, I mean, the most powerful individual unifier we all have now is our mobile phone and our mobile phone number. Having one card that a person can take or use across all the various ranges of public service rather than requiring them to repeatedly do the same thing in terms of establishing identity is inherently efficient.
I mean, I find myself in the peculiar position of having to defend the minister's right to not fetter her discretion. Noel says that there's a lot of discretion left in legislation. First of all, I would say you can't actually legislate for a specific performance and then say something else other than that that procedure is to be used. However, at the end of Section 247C, that's the one that the department says that they're relying on to make this legal. At the end of Section 247C, it says, however, notwithstanding all the above, the minister may use her discretion in respect of accepting alternative forms of identity. Now, what has happened is that the minister has said she will not use her discretion and she will not accept that. And that's a ministerial action known as fettering your discretion. And the difficulty is that if a minister announces, I've fettered my discretion and I'm only going to do this, that in itself is grounds for an appeal for the person who's suffered the consequences of that.
But we're back in the realm of insinuating that it is illegal. The card is not illegal. The Data Protection Commissioner does not say the card is illegal.
She hasn't made a decision.
She says it has a legal basis. She says,
But she has asked for transparency, so
No,
would
she
that not
can't.
intimate that she believes it's not fully transparent at present?
Fully transparent is different than fully legal. God damn it, there are many people with legal authority who operate in in ways that lack transparency. She's effectively said, publish a list of questions and answers. She says she's provided the question. The department says the commissioner says that the department's answers. Publishing the answers to questions is imminent, but she does not say, because she couldn't, because if she was of the view that this card did not have a legal basis, then she should have stopped this card happening years ago.
Okay, I'm sorry, go on, Simon.
If the Data Protection Commissioner gets the answers,
But the Data Protection Commissioner has more qualified people, even I suspect, within the Department of Social Welfare, whatever about the Attorney General's office, who can go and look at the legislation and say, no, you don't have a legal basis for it, and if you insist on this card, we will either speak out against it or bring court challenge against it, or any named individual who's required to have the card can challenge it.
if the Data Protection Commissioner finds that there isn't a legal basis.
But she has found that there is.
No, that she hasn't.
She
If
has.
the Data
She said
Protection
there's a
Commissioner
generic basis in law.
says she says that they've cited one,
Yes.
and that's not the same thing
No,
as
she
she's
says you
accepted
can
it.
cite.
That's right.
Yeah,
but
so-
she doesn't say she's accepted the basis
Which
of
is
that.
my point about how useless that contribution to the debate is. It's because I respect the role of the regulator that I would say the regulator's job
say
is to
what you're
regulate.
saying.
So the regulator should give us a view on whether it has a legal basis or not.
Sure. And if the regulator does give you a view, and she
should have given
says
it 5 years ago.
and she says that it's not legal, does this not leave a very large question mark over the decision-making process internally? And I call this not a political decision-making process. This has been an administrative project.
If the Data Commissioner was now to come to a view that this card is illegal, then it would reveal a flawed process within the department and in the legal advice to the department, and it would reveal a dramatically flawed process in the Data Commissioner, that she let all this happen for 5 years and 2.8 million people without coming out against it. Because I don't believe the Data Protection Commissioner believes it doesn't have a legal basis.
Okay.
She would prefer it had a more transparent legal
I'm going to pull in another couple of comments. This one's slightly incendiary from Michael Williamson on Facebook. He says that the government could have, in quotes, a revolution on its hands like it has never been seen before over this card. And it'll be interesting if that
would
happens.
be surprising.
Martin McMahon says the Road Safety Authority will not accept the driving licences they issue. It has to be the public services card. How utterly crazy is that?
That's for the theory test, presumably.
Yes, I presume it is. Yeah, although it will eventually come in for driving licences also. Do you think that data sharing between government departments, the kind of data sharing we wouldn't want, is going to happen?
Well, I mean, now I have to mentally define the kind of data sharing I wouldn't want and then say I don't like it. I mean, that's very difficult as a hypothetical
a department
question.
having something that it shouldn't have.
Well, we know
has
that
come
does
from another
happen.
department.
What we know is that the Department of Social Protection has been regularly in the headlines over the past, I suppose, 2 years in relation to leakage from the databases within the department, either to private investigators who were working on behalf of third parties, or alternatively in relation to inappropriate accessing of individuals' data. Those things do happen. I mean, that's not a
People break the law.
Yeah.
People break the law all the time. That doesn't mean the gathering of the data of itself is illegal. When people break the law, and here we do need to strengthen across a whole range of areas that access to personal information, inappropriate access, illegal access to personal information is something that should be clamped down. And in many ways, it's not just in advisories. It needs to actually be done now more actively. It has been done to some extent, but more actively by prosecutions of people who inappropriately access information. That is the front line of protections as well as the technological protections against the abuse of data. It's not a reason for not gathering the data itself.
No, and really what it is it's an indicator that if you are going to gather data, work on the assumption that eventually all data will leak. That's a safe assumption. Over time, over a very long scale of time, all data will leak. And therefore, look at the data that you're collecting and only collect the data that you require, specifically for purposes that you can define, and only collect it and keep it for as long as you need it for specifically those purposes.
But aren't we, Simon, living in a world where people are going to be increasingly relaxed about their data?
I think
they're doing it increasingly for the private sector.
I think we're increasingly in a world where people are extremely anxious about their data, and every survey that you do in relation from the Eurostat element to other national surveys shows that people are extremely conscious of the value of their personal data.
But they give it willingly and repeatedly and almost daily to various forms of online activity.
By choice.
By choice.
By
They
choice.
give it. That's my
They
point.
do.
By choice, they
and,
will relax.
And
about it.
this element this card project involves the taking of very sensitive personal data, and we should remember that it's not just the data that's on the card, which is only a token, but also the data that's attached to the card by way of the database back in the department. And the plans involve tying in the information collected via the personal services card to payments to farmers via the AgFood website, to the individual health identifiers database, which is itself eventually going to be tied into the people's health records. This is a significant single point of access to a very large range of information. Google may know a lot about you, but it doesn't know what you said to your doctor the last time you visited.
But isn't the sharing of data increasingly data, as long as it's done properly and with the securities across the health service, has the capacity to transform healthcare and dramatically improve and enhance healthcare? There's absolutely no doubt about that. Every healthcare professional will offer that view to you.
Yes.
That if they can access the relevant medical data for a person, or that is gathered in the system or by the hospital, or whatever previously, that's what the basic concept of a hospital file is for, is so that whoever's treating you tonight can know the greatest amount possible about you in medical terms, provided that comes with necessary protections, as the law does require, then that's a positive thing. The sharing of data is a positive thing.
For the purposes that you've defined there, which is here you are being treated.
Improving
Here you are being treated. Let's have your medical expertise. What we have seen in relation to the individual health identifiers, and I don't want to wander too far off the point, but given that it's tied into the PSC, it's worth pointing out. What we've seen is that there would also be indications that data, and not just indications, statements from the CTO of the HSE, that data would also be given to researchers. Now we're outside the realm of providing you with individual doctor-patient care, and we're into the realm of using aggregated data in respect of your personal data, with or without your consent.
Yes, but anonymised and therefore of incredible value if it allows researchers to spot patterns that will cure disease and, in a sense, alleviate health risks.
It's very difficult to anonymise DNA. In itself, that's a difficult one to run.
But restrictions on publication, identification.
On that note, I'm going to draw this to a close. I want to say thanks a million to both Noel Wheland and to Simon McGarr for being here. Remember, if you have anything else to say, please do say it beneath the video. It'll be going up live on the site later on this evening. And thanks so much for your time. We'll see you all again soon.